Good morning, everyone, and welcome to CSIS and to today's event on the ongoing fight against Boko Haram. My name's Jennifer Cook. I direct the Africa program here at CSIS, and we are so pleased once again to take advantage of the crisis group and their excellent analysts in looking at, we use them and we count on them for a whole range of regional issues, but particularly on Nigeria and on Boko Haram. The fight against Boko Haram is far from over. And while its capacities and capabilities have been significantly weakened since its peak in 2014, the group has proved resilient in the past, it's been flexible in its tactics, and it remains a deadly threat to civilian populations, both in direct attacks and in the massive food and displacement crisis that it has created. So declarations of victory, whether technical or otherwise, and kind of declarations of mopping up operations are not that helpful. They tend to be premature. I would say there's still an important role for kinetic operations to reduce the group's immediate lethality, and that shouldn't be overlooked or dismissed. But at the same time, there has to be planning, strategizing, putting in place the building blocks for a longer-term security architecture that is going to meet the needs of the region. This is contingency planning for the millions of citizens displaced, an economic recovery plan, and a strategy for social conciliation and cohesion. And all of that may be long-term in being realized, but it has to begin and be planned with urgency now. So we are so privileged to have with us Nnamdi Obasi and Hans de Marie Hoengup. Nnamdi is the senior analyst for West Africa. For Nigeria, I'm sorry, and really has a prolific number of reports, each of which has been extremely helpful to us here in Washington. I'm a follower of his on Twitter and Facebook, read all his things, but this is the first time I think we've met in person. So Nnamdi, it's really great to have you here. Nnamdi was, before Crisis Group, was a senior research fellow and the head of Department of Peacekeeping and Humanitarian Affairs at the Center for Strategic Studies and Research at the National Defense College in Abuja. Before that, he was a journalist, a terrific analyst, and with really important networks within Nigeria. Hans de Marie Hoengup, if I'm pronouncing that correctly. We are so very happy to have you here because I think the Cameroon aspect of Boko Haram has not gotten the kind of coverage it warrants here in Washington. There's a lot going on in Cameroon these days, and how the fight against Boko Haram fits within all of that and how the two situations affect each other will be interesting as well. Nnamdi has just, the Crisis Group has just put out a report on the vigilante groups. Do we have copies here for the group? So I think you should have picked them up. Hans has just put out a piece on kind of the humanitarian impacts of Boko Haram. So I'm guessing that you'll speak to those, but I think it would be good for us and for the group to get a bit of a status update on the bigger picture of Boko Haram, even as you focus where you will on the challenges ahead. One last note, Mark Schneider, Senior Vice President at the Crisis Group. I'm getting titles mixed up, I believe that's what you are. This is his last week at Crisis Group, and he has been such a great champion of Crisis Group's work and such a terrific analyst with this global remit. Really want to say congratulations on moving to your next stage, and so happy that we're kind of one of the last hurrahs with the Crisis Group. So we know you're staying generally around, so looking forward to keeping in touch with you. With that, shall we begin with you, Nnamdi, and turn to then Hans, and we'll keep it fairly succinct so we have plenty of time for interaction. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you very much. As I've been introduced, my name is Nnamdi Obasi. I work for Crisis Group in Nigeria. I must say it's a great honor for us to be here at this very distinguished institution and with this very knowledgeable audience to elaborate on our work. It's not, I mean, we couldn't have had a better audience than this. I will speak a little broadly about the situation with the crisis in the northeast of Nigeria. It's not just a Boko Haram military crisis, it's also a humanitarian crisis now. And then I will focus specifically on the report on vigilantes that we've just put out last week. I think it's fairly well known that Boko Haram, as we say, is now on its back foot. In the last 1.5 years, it's been considerably pushed back, a combination of several factors: better resourcing of the Nigerian military, a higher level of motivation and morale among the troops, greater coordination with neighboring countries, and of course the internal division within Boko Haram itself and the diminishing of its resources have put it in a very difficult situation. So lots of the territory, almost all the territory that it once held, have been recovered, but there are still pockets of fighters scattered in the forests. And they are particularly in two areas. There's one group in the southern part of Borno State, the southern part close to the Cameroon border, led by a factional leader, Abubakar Shekau. And there's the other one, also at the fringes of the Lake Chad, led by Banawi, a different factional leader. The military operations are continuing. In fact, as we speak, there is an operation ongoing involving all the 4 countries, and they keep hoping that eventually they will be able to defeat Boko Haram completely. We know that claims of defeat had been made before, but the situation certainly is one in which we can't, certainly make those claims too categorically, because also, as we speak, there's still, suicide bombings and attempted suicide bombings in Maiduguri in Borno State, and I would quite say that it's a fairly different situation now than it was before. The casualties are much lower. The population is much more vigilant. They've been able to, foil or thwart many of the suicide attempts, suicide bombings. It's not like, in the past, but casualties are significantly lower. But that is not to say that all is, perfectly well yet. There's also a risk along the routes. The towns have been recovered, but the roads leading from Maiduguri, the Borno State capital, leading to several towns, Bama, Konduga, Dambua, and so on and so forth, are still, at some considerable risk. In a number of cases, convoys have been attacked, either military convoys or, in a few cases, humanitarian convoys, and other times traders being escorted to markets attacked along the road. So there is still quite some risk, and therefore we think that the job is not yet done. There's still a lot of role for military actors and military operations to play. And that's why in our recommendation, in our recent recommendations, we keep saying, first of all, the military operation has to be sustained, but then it has to be sustained in a coordinated manner among the 4 countries if it's going to achieve results. We also think that there has to be a step up of civilian protection in areas that have been liberated, because people are going back to some of the communities to resettle. The government is eager to get them out of Maiduguri and get them back to resettle. But we are very much concerned about the safety of those communities to which people are being sent back. So there's still a security challenge, there's a military challenge. But beyond that, the major crisis, as we see it now, is the humanitarian challenge. Almost 3 million people were displaced by this conflict, some of them within Nigeria, others into Cameroon and Niger and Chad. Besides the displacement, the economy of the region was terribly damaged by the insurgency. In some communities, people were not able to farm even for 3 years or 2 years before they finally were displaced. So agriculture collapsed completely. Water systems collapsed completely. The governor of Borno State gave an account earlier last month in which he said 30% of residential houses in the state were completely destroyed. Almost 700 municipal buildings involving local government offices, police stations, courts, and so on. The whole range of the civil authority network was significantly degraded in many parts of the state, and that means a lot of reconstruction, has to be done. But the impact of the food crisis is also that there's a health crisis, and so lots of people need urgent assistance. Last year, the donor commitments came only up to 53% of the requirement by the United Nations and major humanitarian organizations. And so this year, there's been a vigorous effort to step up the funding and improve other elements of the humanitarian response, because it's not just the funding. There are also issues about coordination between local and international partners, the sensitivity of the Nigerian government itself. There are issues about relationships between the agencies, international agencies and local agencies. There are issues about coordination of displacement and returns between Nigeria and Cameroon and the other countries, a whole lot of other things that need to be addressed. So these are the priorities that are being dealt with at the moment. I would then focus on the report that we have just put out on the vigilantes. The situation, the report tried to address a number of issues. I think the first one we tried to capture very well was how did the vigilante phenomenon evolve? And it's a very interesting story. It was a situation in which Boko Haram was attacking military, and then the military was reacting and overreacting, because in some communities, they just went and just arrested all the young men because they couldn't identify who was Boko Haram and who was not. So they had to arrest everybody and then try to identify and pull out who was Boko Haram. Sometimes it was an ordeal for the young men. In some areas, where soldiers had been attacked, they just came and said, look, we don't want anybody here again. Just move out of this place. Go to wherever you want to go. But we know that this is, a den of Boko Haram, so we don't want anybody here anymore. And that kind of, community punishment now drove the community itself, boxed in between Boko Haram's violence on one side and the military reprisals on the other side. They had to do something to save themselves. So by May 2013, when the government declared a state of emergency, which effectively shut down the economy of the region because telecommunications especially was cut. So that affected a lot of people, and they had to decide that they needed to do something. And the young men began to mobilize and seek out Boko Haram members and attack them one by one and lynch them and so on and so forth. Eventually drove them out of Maiduguri town. And then the vigilante phenomenon then coalesced into something more organized and then spread out. The model in Maiduguri then was, replicated in the other towns across the state until it became a statewide phenomenon in Borno State. There's a little difference if you move further south of Borno State, in Adamawa State. It didn't exactly evolve in the same way. Of course, the intensity of the violence in Borno State wasn't the same thing as in Benue State, in Adamawa State. When Boko Haram began to attack communities in the northeast corner of Adamawa State, if you look at the map, Michika and Madagali and so on and so forth, then there was an alarm in the capital, Yola, that if this was led to continue, they would march on eventually to Yola. So they mobilized local hunters, and the region has a long history of traditional hunters, and they got them, large numbers of them together, and empowered them, and they fought against Boko Haram. So that's a little difference and we'll talk about that difference later. It has implications, looking forward about what to do with the vigilante groups. Now, what were the motivations about joining? That's the second question we asked, and the result was a combination of push and pull factors. As we said, the push factor was the violence from Boko Haram on one hand, the military on the other hand, and the economy shutting down. All that pushed people into starting to do something for themselves. But there are also, pull factors. Becoming a member of the vigilantes now became a badge of, identification as a of distinguishing young men from Boko Haram. If you could say that, explain that you're a vigilante, then you're free from accusation of, being Boko Haram. For some, it also gave them a sense of power because they were, largely disempowered in that circumstance. So belonging to that organization now gave you, gave them a sense of power to be, within that environment. But there were also others who joined with the intention that expectation that over time, this group will be formalized and recognized by the government and rewarded. And we're talking about an area where there's massive unemployment. So the young men believe that by identifying with the military and helping to fight the insurgency, at the end of the day, some of them could be absorbed into the security services. There were also ladies who, when the civilian vigilante began to apprehend suspects at checkpoints and so on, in that environment, it's a very sensitive cultural issue for men to search women. So it became necessary to actually attract some women into Boko Haram to serve that kind of role. So you had this combination of push and pull factors. Some joining voluntarily, others, called to join. What's the demographics of the group like? In our research, we were there October and November last year and did a lot of work with the vigilantes directly, and they told us that there are officially about 26,000 of them in Borno State. Now, that figure is actually conservative because the 26,000 is mostly around the state capital in Maiduguri, in Jere local government, and so on. If you go further afield, in a lot of communities, they have vigilante groups that are not officially integrated or recognized as part of the civilian JTF. And so if you add up all of that, you may be getting something close to 40,000, some say 50,000, but it's certainly much bigger than the 26,000 officially recognized. In terms of age composition, yes, at the beginning, when it was largely mob action, there were many that were underage. Some of them as young as 10 years old took part in some of the violence against Boko Haram members. Anyone could just join at that time. There was no regulation. There were no limits at all. But over time, especially when they came over under the oversight of the state government and the military and the international scrutiny and so on, they've shed all the underage. I didn't find anybody who was less than 18 years old of the people I related with, and there were quite a number of them. Gender, of course, as you would expect, given the nature of the work, it was largely male. By their own accounts, they have about 200 female out of 26,000. That's less than 1% female. So it's heavily, male organization. What's their relationship? We try to look at their relationship with various other actors in the state, the security organizations, the state government, the traditional rulers. With the security organizations, with the military, they seem to have a certain very ambiguous relationship. On the one hand, the military values them because they play a grassroots role. They understand the terrain very well. They speak the local language. They relate much better with the people. They know who was Boko Haram because they saw them as they were evolving to become Boko Haram. So they play an extremely important intelligence gathering, surveillance role. In some cases, they've taken part to the military in actual combat operations, way out of Maiduguri. But at the same time, the military is very concerned about, they're acquiring combat skills and becoming armed and becoming a challenge to, state security organizations. So it's a rather ambiguous relationship. At some point, the state government began to train some of them. There's 2 phases of training. The first batch was 1,000. The second batch was 850. But after that, the military then, apparently grew cold feet and said, no, we don't want this training to continue unless we are the ones doing the training. So they took about 800 of them to the military training academy, gave them formal military training, basic military training, got them properly vetted and armed so that they could actually contribute to the fight. But beyond that, they don't have any arms. Relationship with the state government, quite formal and quite cordial. The state government actually renamed them and tried to bring them under a skill acquisition, youth empowerment kind of program called Borno Youth Empowerment Scheme. But at the core of that scheme is the vigilante force. And for that scheme, the government trained individuals, among them, the 1,850, are paid an allowance monthly by the government. They have identity cards, they have uniforms. The government provided 40 Hilux trucks for their logistics, and they have a little bit more allowance. But the vast majority are not on the payroll of the government. Once in a while, during festivals, the Muslim Salah, the Eid, the government gives a gift to them, and they share it among themselves, however way they can best share. But they are not permanently the responsibility of the government. Their relationship with traditional authorities is also very, very strong. In fact, we were told that it was the Shehu of Borno, the most prominent traditional ruler in the state, that actually provided the link between them and the state governor, and that helped them to get some legitimacy. So they still have very good relations with the traditional authorities. What's oversight? Because for that kind of organization, of course, oversight becomes a very important issue in an environment of impunity and abuse. Initially, there was very little oversight. They admit that themselves, that there was no oversight whatsoever. They operated like mobs, and they just did what they felt was necessary to do. So in some cases, members of Boko Haram or suspected members of Boko Haram were lynched. Some of them were killed in very gruesome ways and circumstances. They used every means they could. Of course, their justification was nobody was responsible for anything at that point. You can't hold people accountable if you're not provisioning for them somehow, and then the organization was not properly formed. And of course, Boko Haram itself was, inflicting extreme violence on people. So it seemed justified in their own way to respond with, equal measure of violence. So at that initial stage, there was no oversight. There was a lot of violence. But over time, a lot of that has changed. The abuse by the civilian JTF, the vigilantes, has reduced substantially. I mean, there's very little that you can find now. People don't complain about their abuse. They are very substantially tamed force, if you like that word. So within them also, they have their own internal oversight mechanisms. They have, each of the units has a disciplinary committee. They have a provost who oversees matters of discipline. They have a legal advisor of the group who is a respected attorney in Maiduguri. But my sense also was that in their definition of discipline, it was more about respect for hierarchy within the organization, compromise with Boko Haram and so on, much less about human rights and abuse of innocent persons and civilians. I don't think that counted very much in their reckoning, but obviously the situation is better. What's their relationship with other groups? In Borno State, there's like 3 groups. There's the civilian vigilante that evolved in direct reaction to the Boko Haram insurgency. There are hunters who had been there because the place has a long history of hunting, as I said. They've also had, the traditional rulers also have palace guards, what they call the Dogari. They have the palace guards. The palace guards were not a fighting force, actually. They were like an elite group protecting the traditional ruler, except when the community was attacked in those days. Then the Dogari, the palace guards, would join the hunters, the Yambaka, they call them, and they would fight together to ward off external aggression. So in Borno State, you have that mix of the civilian JTF emerging in direct reaction to Boko Haram, the traditional hunters and the Dogari who have been there since, for centuries. And then there's this other organization, the Vigilante Group of Nigeria, which, tried to form even before Boko Haram, but they was formed like a civil defense kind of force, a civil defense group, not really a force because they're not armed. But in the environment of Boko Haram and feeling the pressure, the heat of a common enemy, they kind of, merged and fought together. So they have very good relations between them. My sense was also that each of them, tries to take a lot of credit for pushing back Boko Haram, apparently in expectation that when the rewards come, it will be shared according to, who is seen as having done more. So each of them tries to make a lot of claims, some of which can't be substantiated. What's the public perception of them? It's, on the one hand, it's a little negative. People agree that the involvement of the civilian JTF aggravated, incensed Boko Haram. It now saw the enemy not just as the military and the police, but in fact the communities from which the civilian JTF was being formed. So it, started to fight back indiscriminately against those communities, and that really, created a much more messy situation than you had in the past. There are also, as I said, concerns about abuse by Boko Haram, by the civilian JTF, the vigilantes themselves. But quite frankly, all of this is probably of no concern to a lot of people in Borno State, in the northeast. Lots and lots of people view them as their savior, as the Messiah. They don't care at all. In fact, when you raise some issues about human rights, about Boko Haram, they say, well, Boko Haram didn't show anybody any human rights, so why should we bother about human rights of Boko Haram? They got what they deserved, and if they were given a chance, they would have done the same to others. So it's just measure for measure. There's nothing to worry at all about that. But people really think that they played a very important role. And when you talk about disbanding them, there's a lot of resistance and reservations about disbanding them. There's a loss of faith in government security agencies, the military, the police. Of course, those agencies also have their limitations, right from deficient resourcing to the fact that many of them don't come from that region, don't speak the language, don't understand the terrain, and they can't really operate in that place. You need people who have connections with the grassroots in order to succeed in that campaign against Boko Haram, and that's what the civilian JTF and the vigilantes provided. So they're very much still appreciated, they're still very much admired, and people don't want them really to be disbanded. They might be reformed, they might be reorganized. They might be reorganized, but certainly they don't want them disbanded. Looking forward, that's the concern. What do you do about them when the conflict is over? Again, they themselves, being a mix of so many youths that came from different directions, some were students in school, and they're saying, well, the government owes us a scholarship to go back to school. Basically, there's a very strong sense of entitlement among them. They think they've made a lot of sacrifice for the country, they've suffered losses and so on. The country owes them, the government owes them. So those who want to go back to school, they're asking for scholarships. Those whose businesses were disrupted, who left their business to join civilian JTF, are asking for grants and some little packages to go back and restart their business. Some have no skills whatsoever, and they are insisting on being put through a skills training program. Some, who believe they are qualified, expect that they should be absorbed into the military. About 250 of them have been absorbed in the military, but of course that's a very small number if you're talking about 26,000 or even 40,000. The state government talked about employing some of them, traffic wardens, waste management personnel, and so on and so forth. But that hasn't quite gotten off the ground, so they're still, very much there and waiting for. They also think that they ought to get some recognition from the government, something symbolic, that an honor that's given to them, which haven't been given. There are about 600 of them were killed by Boko Haram. And they expect that, if something is being done, especially for Boko Haram members that are deserting under the Operation Safe Corridor, the exit route provided by the government, then something should be done for those who actually fought against Boko Haram rather than Boko Haram that did damage to the rest of the community. So in our recommendation, we tried to distinguish between these categories and suggested some of these to be done. But at the end of the day, there's still a number that are left that would want to continue with vigilante duties, and people expect them to continue with that duty. So we recommended that they should be constituted into an auxiliary and put under the control of the police, so that they don't operate as an independent force. They serve an intelligence and surveillance function, report back to the police, help with demining operations, those kinds of things, first aid, emergency response. They could be useful in those regards, and then gradually scaled down. What the structure will be eventually, we can't be very categorical about that. The report is actually intended to start a discussion, which is not taking place at the moment, on what direction things should go, and we will be happy to see that discussion progressing. I think I want to stop there. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much. And lots of questions. Oh, yes, lots of questions coming out. But yes, Hans, why don't you take some time to talk about the situation in northern Cameroon, and then we'll open up for Q&A. So,
thank you. I will be first trying to broadly and briefly speak about the situation of Boko Haram in the far north Cameroon. and then trying to stressing which are the similarities and differences regarding the vigilante questions between Nigeria and Cameroon, some specificity regarding Cameroon. It's important to remind that Boko Haram rise in Cameroon in a particular context. Cameroon has 10 regions or provinces, if you want, 23 millions of people in total, and the most populated is the Far North region with 4 millions of people. Even before the rise of Boko Haram, it was already the region assembling and accumulating the worst socioeconomic indicators of the entire country. Just taking some of them, if you take the national rate of poverty in 2013, before Boko Haram, it was 37%. In the Far North, it was 75%. You can take the same indicators regarding the health centers, regarding the rates of literacy or education. It's a region that was the most vulnerable of the country. Also important to notice that it's a region with a long and past history of communal violence and tensions, whether it is the main fracture between the Kotoko and Arab Shua, or some very few skirmishes that have occurred between the Kotoko, for example, and other tribes and ethnic groups in the region, like, for example, the Massa and the others. It's also a region with an history of traffickings in terms of arms smugglings, light weapons, local drugs that is called tramadol, cars stolen, and things like that. It is finally a region that even before Boko Haram was already a security concern for Cameroon State, given the fact that there has been a rise of those that are called locally Cooper de Route, highways robbers, that mainly were constituted by Cameroonian and also former rebels group members coming from Central African Republic and Chad and even Sudan, and that have operated in the area in the 90s up to middle of 2000. For example, the creation of the main elite unit, the Rapid Intervention Brigade, was for the purpose of countering and curbing the insecurity, urban and rural insecurity in the Far North region. It is also a region that in many criteria, sociological criteria, if I take the case of the language, it's much more connected to northeast of Nigeria and Borno State than Cameroon. When you go to Logoneshari department, for example, or to the border town, you will very rarely see people speaking French, English, or even the Fulfulde, which is the lingua franca in the Great Northern Cameroon in general. But they rather speak Kanuri, Arabic, or Mandara, or Ikotoko for those who are Kotoko. Another indicator I usually take is even in terms of economic activities. It will take for a usual businessman 3 days to move from Douala, to move a product from Douala to Kusiri. Douala is the economic capital of Cameroon, and Kusiri plays like the economic capital of the Far North. Why? It will need just 4 hours to move from Kusiri to Maiduguri. I mean, before the crisis, before the interruption of Boko Haram. There are many things, the ethnicity ties, the fact that Banki, for example, and Amshide in Cameroon, that Gambaru Gala in Nigeria and Fotokol in Cameroon, and many other cases, these were just one village, and they are even remaining the same. And in some cases, it's the same traditional chief who is overseeing for all of them. Many of the strongholds of Boko Haram, like Goza and so on, used to be just in the 1961 members of Cameroon before the fact that the Northern Cameroon chosen to join the Nigeria. So this is important to highlight, to see the context. I don't want also to stress the point of how some Salafi or Wahhabi trends have spread in the fan of Cameroon. That has been highlighted in one of our reports, but definitely, although the Muslims are not the majority in the fan of Cameroon, they have some concentration like Marwa and in the border town, where they are in the majority and where the Salafi influence are the strongest. So this is the context and the background in which that Boko Haram exploited to rise from 2009 up to 2013 in Cameroon before launching now very confrontational approach attacks against Cameroonian army in early 2014. So how has Boko Haram precisely penetrated in Cameroon? When looking, for example, on the drivers of recruitment, we found that in Cameroon there were 3+1 categories. The most important one was the socio-economic incentives. Definitely among the 4,000 Cameroonians who have actively joined Boko Haram in the last 3 years, the majority, we don't know exactly which percentage, but the majority have been incensed by either the motorbags that Boko Haram used to offer to some of the members, by the salaries that they used to give at the beginning when you were just joining. Sometimes the salary can be paid up to 6 months. By also some social promises, like offering you, for example, a wife. And in many cases, Boko Haram has succeeded in that because hundreds of young ladies have been kidnapped in the far north and have been offered as wives to the strongest fighters or combatants. So beyond these socio-economic incentives, you have another group of people recruited based properly on the ideologies drivers. That is a mix of the idea of jihad first, but also mixing that with the idea that we will revive or reanimate the former Kanem-Borno Empire. This is the time for Kanuri to become something important, like it was the case in the past. Anti-Western feelings also, exploiting also the little legitimacy or acceptance of the state in the area. And you have the last category that can be like 1,000 or a little bit less of people who have been basically kidnapped, then indoctrinated on drugs and being members of Boko Haram or forced to be so. You have a last category that is very difficult to where to put them. I mean, there is roughly 200 small villages, very small ones of 100 or less than 100 people in the border towns with Nigeria. When the war has started, the Cameroon Defense Forces were doing what they call defense on zone. So that means they have very big military bases, and when there was an important attack, you call them and they call. The problem is that the effectivity of this methodology or type of defense was quite debatable. Why? Because in many cases, first, they didn't want to come out at night, and most of Boko Haram attacks were at night. Secondly, they could arrive 1, 2, 3 days after the attack has occurred. I mean, Boko Haram is already gone back in Nigeria. And we were discussing with some people in villages like Labado, for example, and other villages precisely alongside the border of the Waza road. And they were telling us, we have had this case. We are 90 in our village. Boko Haram arrives and say, join our movement. We share the same tribe with them. We have the same chief. We share the language, how we view the world, things like that. Despite the fact that we don't agree to the violence, and somehow we think the Salafi idea are not bad. But we're reluctant to join because from the violence, that's not good. But when they are coming, they propose us money. And they kill 2 among us to show that for those who will not join, it will be the death as punishment. When they do that like 2, 3 times, each time we call the government and say, Boko Haram has come, they arrive 2 days, 3 days later. But now, given this situation, after 2, 3, 4 months, 2, 3, 4 weeks, some of us, either because they are finally convinced or because they fear or because it's a mix of that plus the money they have received, they decide to join the movement. And the government, the security forces hear that in this village, 6, 7, 8, 9 times have joined, they will arrive, maybe take all the young men except those who are old, beat them, maybe take by hazard even 10 and go in jail, in detention with them. This kind of situation has in some time pushed entire village to join Boko Haram. So difficult to put this category, but it's a category of people who were like almost no choice than joining the movement. So when we are seeing properly on the military point of the battle, we see that it was quite an almost conventional warfare between May 2014 and June 2015, with some regular attacks of Boko Haram gathering hundreds of insurgents against positions of Cameroonian army, Fotokol, Amshide, in Makari, in Il Alifa, in Waza district, in Mayo-Moskota, in all these places. More and more, since June, we have seen another 2 phases of decrease of Boko Haram activities in Cameroon, in terms of the frequency of attacks per week, in terms of the intensity of each attack. If they used to gather up to 1,000, like one of the most spectacular attacks in early February 2015 in Fotokol, now you can very, very hardly see an attack of Boko Haram member gathering more than 50 insurgents in one sole attack. We observe also a decrease in the capacity of attractivity or seduction of the ideology or what you can call like that, as consequence also in the pattern of the recruitment of Boko Haram members. We have seen that the more we were going in 2016, the more some recruitment were more false recruitment. So these are some clear indications showing that, we can say in Cameroon, for example, Boko Haram on the military point is on the back foot. But having said that, when looking at the incident and the indicator, there is no month without at least one incident reminding you that it's a group still in capacity to inflict heavy casualties to local population or to the civilians. And it's quite interesting to see how Boko Haram has been able also to adapt to the new balance of power with the Cameroonian army. From July 2015, where they started the suicide bombing up to today, in our accounts, we are roughly around 55 suicide bombings that they have organized in less than 1 year and a half. At the same time, nearly 60 suicide bombings have been prevented thanks to the implication of the vigilante group. When you put all this figure together, you are about 110 suicide bombing attempted or succeed. It's quite a tremendous number, and just in Cameroon alone. I mean, in Nigeria, it is much more bigger than that. They have tried also the same in N'Djamena. Now, when portraying the current situation, yes, they are on the back foot, but still in capacity to be a regional threat and inflict casualties in Cameroon, avoid the development projects in the Far North region. What on which we are researching currently now are the socio-economic consequences of this crisis, because the paradox is the decrease of Boko Haram in Cameroon has not led to a decrease of, let us say, the number of IDPs or refugees. It's the contrary. This month is the highest in terms of IDPs and refugees in the Far North than even when Boko Haram was stronger. We have started in 2014 with roughly 18,000 refugees coming from Nigeria, and now we are 90,000. We can do the same with the IDPs, who are now 200,000, accentuating the situation of people from the Far North, who was already very difficult even before the crisis. We are also looking on how, in somehow, some measures taken by the government to cut the supply channels of Boko Haram, to starve Boko Haram, may have some counter effects on the population, by the sense that it's aggravating the socioeconomic vulnerabilities. I mean, the bans of motorbikes activities, the closure of the borders. Hundreds of thousands of people were relying in the business with Maiduguri, with Bama, with towns like this in Nigeria. And this is having now a very important economic effect in the daily life of the population and in Cameroon as a whole, because it's always very difficult when we want to assess the economic impact of the Far North in the entire GDP or something of the Cameroon, given the fact that first, Cameroonian economy is highly informal, but the Far North is certainly the most highly informal economy of all the Cameroonian states. So how to measure exactly is quite difficult. We also stressing the point that some measures of the government, like these dozens of small villages that they are forcibly displaced for the purpose of building military barracks there because they thought this is a strategic point where we should have a military barrack. So these 2 small villages should be removed with no plans to settling them back, with no accompaniment or things like that. That is an issue that we are stressing now. And discussing the second and last point, the one of the vigilante group, I will more focus on what are the similarity and the differences with Nigeria. In Cameroon, there is a long history of vigilante group, or let us call them, in the past, local self-defense group. So it's not something new. Of course, it has never been largely and organized like now to face Boko Haram. But when taking, for example, during the civil war for independence, I mean, it was against France, and when the first President Aïdjo got the power, arrived in power, one political party called UPC, that was also a military movement, decided that it's not a real independence, and the President Biya is just a proxy of France. So they continue the fightings, and the government largely at that time used vigilante group to fight against these people. In the 90s, also, we see the vigilante group emerging again, precisely in the way of protecting the neighborhood, the things like that, controlling who is getting in, who is getting on. Sometimes with some colonial, how will I put it, colored tribes. As some neighbor were identified like Ede Bamileke, so supposed to support the opposition party, and the others are more BT and things like that. When talking of the fan of precisely, there is a long history of vigilante group. As Namdia explained, the traditional chief have what is called, is like the presidential guard, the personal guard. They are called Dogari. But now, given the fact there were tensions and fights between villages, between groups, ethnic groups, they used to mobilize some youth in the community to go and fight against the other, or for the purpose of defending the community in case the community is attacked, which is different to the Dogari, the personal guard of the chief. We can date back the beginning of mobilization of the civil self-defense group, these kind of things, to this period. In the 90s, this vigilante group have resumed again because there were this high insecurity I've just mentioned in the background presentation, given the Chadian rebel, the Central African rebel, the Cooper de Road, all these people, the villages again have used this youth to protect against these people. Now, more recently, when Boko Haram started, in many cases, spontaneously, the villages are formed, improvised local self-defense group because there was no presence, enough presence of the security forces. The time going, the security forces have realized this vigilante group as indispensable and very effective, and they have now said each village should organize a local self-defense group. Even in terms of how this is legally formalized. In Cameroon, since 1987, and possibly even more before, you have several presidential instruction or regional instruction organizing the local self-defense group. And the most recent one is the one of 2014, in June 2014, where the former governor of the Far North signed a regional instruction to formally organize what are called the vigilante unit. Two things also fundamental to mention. In Cameroon, the vigilante unit rise historically and even now based on two factors. The first is Cameroon historically has got the obsession that they could be one day invaded by Nigeria or something like that. And that definitely they are small states compared to the other. So they have designed what they call popular defense, which is like the core of strategic, the doctrine of defense of Cameroon. And in this popular defense, they were saying, as we know we are not a strong army, we will rely on the vigilante unit, we will rely on the population and things like that. That is why it was so easy for Cameroon to deal with the issue of vigilante and things like that. The second is the vigilante group emerged in the context of a weak and fragile state unable to provide security in the entire country. That is why in Douala and in Yaoundé, even when we were young children, in all the villages and all the neighborhoods, there were local self-defense groups who were there to check who is getting out, in and out in the neighborhood. During night especially, they usually have knives, things like that. So it is a common culture and tradition, even what is called popular justice, a common culture and tradition, given also the level of corruption of the police. Even when they are there, they're reluctant to provide security, even when there is a police station in the neighborhood. Now, what about the organizations and of the vigilante group in Cameroon? Roughly, they are in between 13 and 16,000 for those in the far north. On the contrary of Nigeria, where most of them are in between 18 and 24 years old, in Cameroon, the majority are above 25. You will see the people up from 15 up to 24, but the majority are definitely above 25 in Cameroon. That also allowed me to share one. I remember, because we started the first research on that in March 2016, then we have much more intensified one from October 2016 to January 2017 recently. We went to several border towns. In some places where we could not reach, we just invited them to come, either in Mora, Mokolo, Kuseri, or Makari, places like that, to discuss with them. And I was surprised. I was arriving with the idea that certainly most of them wanted to join the armed force after the conflict. It's not the case. It's not the case. Why? Because first, the age factor. In Cameroon, there's a law saying if you have completed only the primary school, you cannot join the military forces at a certain age. I think it's 30 years old or something like that. And most of them have just completed or have not even completed the primary school. The second factor is that even themselves, the majority do not necessarily want to be integrated in the armed force after. I remember precisely one vigilante member of Limani who was telling me that I used to earn equal to something like $50 when I was trading with Banki, with Maiduguri per day. What will I do in the security forces when I know that the rank I will have there will be like 5 times less in terms of salary per month? So I prefer better the situation to go back to what it was before Boko Haram, or where I was independent and things like that. You have also people there who want to study something. The gender dimension is the same also in terms of. Thank you. The gender dimension is the same also in Cameroon. I've not precisely counted, but I'm not sure they are more than 10 or 5% in the vigilante group. And most of the women who are there to check the women, because there is this phenomenon of girls used as suicide bombings to a larger scale. And the last point maybe I could highlight is we have researched also on the possibility of cooperation between the vigilante groups in Cameroon and in Nigeria. Are there exchange and things like that? And it's happened that some vigilante group in Cameroon and Nigeria are sharing information about who is crossing the border or is doing what. And in one particular case, I mentioned that because the unique case where we have found that in Turu, for example, and also in Mayo Moskota district, we have found a case of vigilante group in Cameroon and Nigeria. We have already been together involved in one battle. That means Boko Haram attacking, for example, Turu. People from the vigilante group of Madagali or Limankara, we've come to help the vigilante group of Turu and vice versa. So that's all.
Multinational Civil Joint Task Force. Listen, thank you very much to both of you. I mean, I think what comes out in the report and the talks are kind of the many ethical kind of dilemmas and the moral hazard issue. I mean, I think it is important to recognize, and kind of that symbolic kind of acknowledgement of the role that they've played is important. Even though there's a lot of fear about what they might become, and so but you don't want to demonize this group on the one hand. And you know, I was talked about the start about a longer-term security architecture. I mean, police will need to be at the center of that, kind of some kind of policing, community policing model. But how how CJTF or members kind of fit into that is, I just don't know that there's even the push on the police reform that will be necessary, much less thinking through what the vigilante component, how that will look. And my fear is that as Boko Haram gets pushed more and more, the urgency of thinking about these things kind of falls away. And so you just have that continued cycle. And so this kind of reporting and kind of the research agenda too that you're putting out there, kind of getting the attention of senior leadership in both countries at the state and national level, really important. Why don't we open up for questions? I know there'll be quite a few of them. I'll take 3 at a time, if that's okay with you all, and I might throw a few in myself.
Remember the 3 by the end of the...
Pardon?
It's okay.
We'll try to keep the questions short, and we'll try to keep the answers reasonably short as well. The gentleman here, and then Deirdre. We'll go over here next.
Hi, I'm Gary Sargent. I'm a retired Army Special Forces officer by trade. Do a little bit of work with USAID. My question for Mr. Obasi is really, Boko Haram on its heels, the beginning of what you said. And if you look at the LRA in Uganda, okay, we've been engaged directly and indirectly since mid-90s dealing with them, and they're still there. So I'm just sort of looking for a little bit more detailed tactical response on, what's really happening with them and where they're going.
Great. We'll go Deirdre, and then the gentleman here.
Hi,
And then we'll come over here.
I'm Deirdre Lepin. I'm a Nigerian researcher and consultant. Good to see you again, Nnamdi, and good to meet you, Hans. How are you? What to do with the civilian JTF? This was the question. Is there a possibility that a non-security job could be developed for that group, such as in rebuilding the Northeast? That would be a perfect opportunity through a kind of jobs program to teach skills and incorporate them back into the community. A lot of ex-combatants have been demobilized in this way. GIZ, for example, has had a lot of experience with this. So I'm wondering if that would be feasible. Nnamdi, you've done a lot of writing on South and Southeastern Nigeria. And, the solution, such as the amnesty, has been discussed, but people are trying to reform the amnesty now. So paying stipends of 65,000 naira per unit is not the solution. What to do?
And then the gentleman here.
My name is Dr. Ayotinde Gbalajabi. I just finished my PhD program from Howard University. My question is directed to Mr. Obasi. Do you think the only hard power used by the Nigerian government can win the fight against Boko Haram, or the combination of hard power and soft power? Because we are about to make the same mistake of we having the vigilante, and if successfully we can fight and defeat Boko Haram, these vigilante, what are we going to do about them? Because the Boko Haram issue is an ideology issue. It's not we killing the people. And about like the indicator you gave about the 75% poverty rate in northern Cameroon, most people are jobless. The educational facility are being destroyed. So most of these people are not being empowered. So do you think we can have a sustainable fight against Boko Haram, or win the fight against Boko Haram? Thank you.
Maybe I'll just add one to that, and then we'll come over to this side. In terms of the vigilante's role in reintegrating those who have, been members of Boko Haram, and kind of arbitrating that. I mean, in some, Hans, you talked about, the different levels of culpability, or whatever you want to call it. I mean, a lot of people have been coerced into that, and a lot of people kidnapped into it. A lot of people seen their family members killed one by one until they join. Then there's the economic incentives, and then there's the kind of hardline ideological, which, I don't know how big a group that is, in fact. And some of the CJTF guys in Maiduguri talk about how early on they would kind of hold community hearings on some of the people who had been captured or identified as Boko Haram and whether they could be integrated. And I mean, that could be a double-edged sword, again, as so much with vigilante groups in general, but I just wonder if there is a thought to their role in that. So why don't we take those and then we'll move over here for questions.
I think your question was about the end state, the possible end state of Boko Haram, given the situation with the LRA and similar groups. Well, let's not be under any illusions about this. This is not going to end overnight. The correct strategy, or the best that can be done, is to cut it down to size as much as possible and try to change the environment in which it grew previously and keep it as low as possible, expecting that over time and over a long time, it's going to eventually die. But for now, that's not possible. First of all, the environment in which that group grew is still very much there until it's changed. Two, there are people who are, if you like, marginal Boko Haram. They believe in the ideology of Boko Haram, but they disagree with the methods, the violence, especially when it spread and then became indiscriminate and so on. So it still has sympathizers who can, if there is not sustained effort, can be again drawn in to replenish the ranks, and then this continues all over again. So it's not a short call, it's a long haul trying to deal with this. It's to need sustained effort for a very long time, which speaks to the other questions also that have been asked. They're very much related. There was a question that is there a non-security role which the CJTF can play? Well, yes, they can play a role if there are major reconstruction projects in the region, they can be engaged in that. But everybody realizes that that's a short-term kind of employment. The Borno state government is also working on major agricultural projects and expecting that they will be engaged in those kinds of projects. But let me also say that they are not seen, the vigilantes, and I'm putting it in the context of the wider vigilante situation in Nigeria, they are not seen as an abnormality. Almost everywhere in Nigeria, there is some vigilante formation of some sort. If you go to the western part of the country, you have an ethnically based vigilante, the Odua People's Congress, the OPC. It's an ethnic reaffirmation kind of cultural group, but also plays guard and law and order roles and so on and so forth. As a matter of fact, there was a survey that was done sometime, I think 2 years ago, and people were asked whether they believed in the police or in the OPC. And 75% said they had more confidence in the OPC than in the police. So those kinds of things, have always been there. Even where they don't have the vigilantes as major formations, it's accepted that you have neighborhood watch groups that are recognized by the police, that work in harmony with the police. The police says, okay, if you get suspects, bring them to us. Don't punish anybody. We have that role, but you help us keep watch. And so what I'm saying is in Borno State, especially given the very aggravated security situation, there's a very strong desire, if you like, among the population to still have some presence, some operations of the civilian JTF. And as I said, the government forces, let me explain a little. We have a system in Nigeria by which recruitment to security agencies is done proportionally from all parts of the country in order to make sure that no part of the country, has, dominance in the security organization. So, and then Kanuri, in the area in which this is happening, is in one corner of the country. If you take many Southerners from the southern part of the country and deploy them to the police in Maiduguri or in Bama and Konduga, they're hardly useful because they don't understand the language, they don't understand the culture. They're viewed as, if you like, they will use the word strangers. And this is not only about the North, it's also about the South. It's about the same thing in most other parts of the country. So to some extent, you need people who have local knowledge, who understand the language, who have been part of the social dynamics of that environment, and then provide a complementary role to the government security agencies. So the question is not whether they will be there or not, they will be there. The question is then under whose supervision, under whose oversight, whether they will be armed or not, and what is to be done about them. How do they exit from that organization in the long run? Those kinds of questions are, I think, what. Then the last question was, the third question was about hard power alone. You are perfectly correct. Hard power is not going to solve the problem, and we have emphasized that in virtually all our reports. This problem did not arise because of a lack of the army and a lack of bullets and a lack of firepower. It evolved from a certain deficit in governance and economic provision and social environment and so on. And so unless you are addressing those environmental factors, no, you're not going to solve the problem. And more recently, we've also argued that, in fact, the Boko Haram insurgency is only an aggravating factor in an environment that was already structurally highly vulnerable. Climate change effects leading to desertification, leading to degradation of the environment, damaging livelihoods, a very high rate of population growth. Lots of people there have 11 children and 13 children and 23 children and 30 children and so on. You can't have development with that kind of population growth. So again, something has to be done about that. We've also had very low investment by governments in education, in health, in housing, in water supply, and so on, and the massive amount of impoverishment about which nothing has been done over time. Unless all these issues are dealt with, military force is not going to solve any problem in the long run.
I hope the White House is listening.
Yeah, you asked whether the civilian JTF could have a role in reintegrating ex-Boko Haram. I don't see that role now. As a matter of fact, there is a very deep sense of grievance among the civilian JTF against the Boko Haram. There is a government program that's called Operation Safe Corridor, and Boko Haram members defecting or surrendering to the military are supposed to go to that program and be debriefed and de-radicalized and maybe given some training and reintegrated to society. That program is extremely unpopular with the civilian JTF and with people in Borno State. In fact, people think that you can't be rewarding people who did so much damage to the environment when the victims haven't been taken care of, haven't been compensated. So it's a very unpopular program. And people still say, when the government finishes with the program, whenever the Boko Haram come back to the communities, they are going to still exact punishment on them. Yeah, so part of what needs to be done, as we are discussing, again, we'll have to develop that further, is that people don't have a sense of justice and redress and closure. Nothing has been done about the Boko Haram members. Nobody has been tried. Nobody has been jailed. There's no discussion taking place about that. And the character of the atrocities that they committed is particularly painful to a lot of people. I was talking with a woman. She told me they came in her presence and beheaded her husband. There's no way she can forgive that kind of thing. I talked to another woman. She said they wanted to take her son away. She said, no, please leave him. And they said, no, in fact, we're going to kill him. So you hold him down and we kill him. And they got her hands on his ankles and pressed him while they slit, his neck. Now, for that kind of situation, there's no way. Communal healing is going to be extremely difficult. And it must be accompanied by transitional justice. Unfortunately, these discussions are not taking place, at the moment, and we need to focus attention on them.
Okay, we'll go with me, Ladi, and then Alexis.
Thank you very much. My name is Nia Kwete. I lived in Abuja when setting up the Soros Foundation, so I have particular interest. It's good to see you here.
Thank you very much.
I was wondering about Boko Haram being on the back foot. If you read the news from here, you look in the Middle East, ISIS is on the back foot. But part of the narrative is that there is a likelihood that they will be scattered from the Middle East into other parts, Nigeria and West Africa being one. So do you see a possibility of Boko Haram resurging as a result of what is happening, as a result of the defeat of ISIS? And also, I'm wondering if you can assess how well the international community has supported the Boko Haram countries in fighting when you compare the international effort in fighting ISIS.
Ladi. She's coming.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Ladi. The question is for both of you, please. Do you see any kind of community-to-community plans for the post-conflict transition? You talked of, Mr. Obasi, you talked about the Emir of Borno, and I think you mentioned some of the traditional rulers. Is there any kind of communication between them on how to address the vigilantism and what to do post-conflict?
Great, thank you. And then Alexis. Right, you're on the next.
Thanks. Alexis Arief with the Congressional Research Service. It's good to see you both. Hans, I wonder if you could help us understand how the situation in far north Cameroon fits into the larger constellation of security and political challenges that the Cameroonian government is currently facing, whether it's the protests in the West, the coming electoral cycle, and uncertainty about Biya's future, broader strains seemingly between sort of center and periphery in a very centralized state. To what extent should we see the far north as just one among many challenges to regime stability versus perhaps a potential way of shoring up regime stability in the face of sort of regional cross-border challenges? I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And to just add one more thread, if you could comment on the impact of the beer's expansion and increased ability to partner with sort of elite foreign actors on broader intra-military dynamics and how that fits in again to those sort of regime challenges.
The whose expansion? I didn't.
The beer's
Okay.
expansion.
Let's come back to you. Do you want to go first?
Okay. No, well, I think
Okay.
Hans can go.
Hans?
Okay. So I will start with the last question. Over time, the BIA has significantly expanded in Cameroon. I remember when it was created, it was a Bataillon Léger d'Intervention in 1999. Then it became the BIA in 2001. It was a unit of 900 people. And now they are 7,000, and possibly there will be 7,500 or 8,000 in the next 2 years. All that's not just linked to the threat of Boko Haram, but also the necessity of the stability of Yaoundé regime, given what is rising in the Anglophone region and the possible violence linked to the next election next year. So these are intrinsically linked. The regime like the Presidential Guard, as you know, in the sociology of defense of Cameroon, have a different commandment, which is directly tied to the presidency, and even the funding and the budget of this fund, of these two units, are completely different to the budgets of the Ministry of Defense. But there are some surprises that we can have when researching on this issue. Traditionally, there used to be some tensions between the people from the B and the Presidential Guard on the one hand, and those of the regular army on the other hand. Why? First, the regular army people are less in terms of salary, in terms of advantages, in terms of equipment, in terms even of the consideration that the presidency or the government has compared to the B and the Presidential Guard. Even in the attitude, there was a kind of attitude of people from the Presidential Guard or the B that they are above the law, they are above the other units and things like that. And this has even played a role during the fight against Boko Haram. But now, the fight against Boko Haram in somehow has a little bit change the things. The first changing is that the B and the Presidential Guard in Cameroon were originally built to be force that can be neutralize each other. That is why when the Presidential Guard was 2,000 people going to 2,500, the B will also increase its recruitment, the same number of equipment, the same people training the two forces, the Israeli particularly. But due to the fact against Boko Haram, the B has taken the lead compared to the Presidential Guard because, they were on the battle and they said, we are encountering Boko Haram, so we need tanks that they used to not have, for example. And we need that to fight against Boko Haram, even if the Presidential Guard do not have it. We need our number to be significantly increased compared to the number of the Presidential Guard. We need more trainings. We need so on and so forth. And this ends up to the fact that now the B has got a kind of air power. It's not a strong one, but they have a couple of M24 helicopters. They have a couple of marine. They have also a marine forces. They have expanded to 7,500 now. While the Presidential Guard is remaining between 4,000 and 5,000. So, and this has also played a role in the internal relationship between the regular army and the B. As I said, there used to be tension, even deep tension between the two. But when the B arrived in the far north, they knew that we are the elite unit, we are strongest, we have all the equipment, we don't need you. I have a lot of stories of the people, the soldiers from the regular army who were telling them, even in some cases, the B people were just arriving and say, look, move, you will slow us in the battle. But when Boko Haram started launching the attacks with 500 people, especially against one of the biggest military bases of the B in Kolofata and Amshide, and they have suffered casualties, they realized that because the B is not an infantry forces, so they don't have tanks. Boko Haram was coming with tanks. They realized they need the help of the regular army, which has all these tanks, all this infantry. And they started being less arrogant and called the regular army for the help during the attacks. And the more they were doing so, the more also, as I was saying, they have started being humble. The cooperation was less difficult. Still, there are still tensions, especially out of the far north between the B and the rest of the army. But now they realize they need the others, and the others feel that they are less arrogant than in the past. Something has a little bit changed. And also politically, when analyzes this crisis, we can see that the war against Boko Haram had, I prefer using had, impacting in terms of a kind of popularity of the Cameroonian army. In the past, Cameroonian army was highly unpopular because it was perceived as the cement of Biya regime, people that are sent to kill the people who are striking or who are in riot, things like that. But thanks to Boko Haram, people have said, so they can also defend the country, they can have a kind of utility. They started becoming popular, especially within social media. But I'm fearing that with the Anglophone riots and how the wars behave of the armed force there, this small popularity that they have gained has just vanished quickly. Also, how the far north issue more broadly, it's true that since 4 years, small tensions are appearing everywhere in the eastern side. Maybe we have forgotten, but in 2013, there was no 1 or 2 days without an incursion of Seleka, anti-Balaka militia in eastern side of Cameroon or Adamawa region. And still now, it is still an area very fragile and with possibility of having the things every time there. All the borderline from the north region with Tuboro up to Adamawa region, up to the eastern region is a region fragile. When looking now on how, the army in general is overstretched given all these tensions. More than 15,000 soldiers and policemen have been recruited the last 2 years for Boko Haram purpose, from eastern region purpose, and now for the Anglophone region, more recruitment have been launched, and the regime certainly has in mind that the next election is coming, and something can happen, so they are preparing themselves. last question, is there any kind of post-conflict communication and plan? In Cameroon, no. In Cameroon, no, and that allows me to come back to the issue of defectors. I mean, many of you are aware that hundreds of people have surrendered in Chad, 100 have surrendered in Niger. When we were there in January, so last 2 months ago, we were discussing with traditional chief, vigilante member and people in Touro, in Mayo Moscota, in Kourgi also, and we have heard a lot of things about Boko Haram members who have tried to be in touch both with the vigilante members and Cameroonian Boko Haram members, and with the traditional chief saying, we are a group of 123, we want to surrender. Can you guarantee us that we will not be immediately killed by the armed force? We are a group of 13, we are a group of 20. There are things like that that is happening. But when discussing with, it's the same analysis that I'm sharing. When discussing with traditional chief, the vigilante member, the local population, do you want them to come after a kind of reintegration or I don't know, whatever amnesty? People are strongly opposed. I mean, very, very highly opposition against any kinds of reintegration of the. We try to discuss the same issue at the state level, at the Ministry of Justice, at the Ministry of External Relations. That was with the Central Africa Project Director. We felt the same opposition of the state and the armed force. There is no question about that. But we think rather than presenting to them the question like it's a question of human rights or whatever we usually portray it, it's better to tell to the government that it is in their interest, if they want a sustainable victory against Boko Haram, if they don't want to maintain 8,000 to 9,000 indefinitely in the far north, that will end up by jeopardizing the program of development of the country. It is in their interest that they don't have 1,000 to 2,000 Cameroonian Boko Haram members at the borderline who actually maybe do no longer want to be members of Boko Haram but fear to come back. And as they want to eat, they want to survive, they will continue with the very small skirmish just to steal food. And you will maintain the region in a kind of turmoil, things like that. So when we're
getting close to go. Keep going, okay. But just wrap.
Yeah. We spoke first to the Ministry of External Relations with putting in front the issue of reintegration, human rights. We were near to be expelled from his office. Now we went to the Ministry of Justice. We now put the issue of sustainable victory, the need to do. Now they were more open to the discussion. I said, yeah, you are right. Maybe we should do some things against that. But that raised the issue that Namdi has raised, that we should first not use the word DDR or amnesty, use another imaginative word, and another imaginative type of DDR, which will not be perceived as a reward of violence by the local population.
Great.
Yeah,
you have the.
I think your question was, can Boko Haram bounce back? We say it's. I wouldn't say from the ISIS fight, but I would say that we must be very concerned about the possibility of Boko Haram bouncing back. For one, it's a group that has shown considerable resilience since 2009. At the time, Yusuf, the original leader, was killed, and they were, driven out of Maiduguri. There was this calm for a year, and it looked like they had been defeated, and it was all over. But they were able to fight back, and with much greater strength as it turned out. And over the years, we've had several times when there have been, predictions that it's all getting to be over. They've been, decimated. There's been dispersed. We are mopping up. We've technically defeated them. They no longer have a capacity for organized attacks. They can't attack the military anymore, and so on and so forth. But the group has been able to sustain itself for, some way or the other. So you can't write them off. Now, there's also the concern that if after some time there's a loss of concentration by the Nigerian government for all kinds of reasons, I mean, we're having a controversy now about, whether President Buhari will stay on or not, and that will lead to a new phase of maneuvering by various actors, and then Vice President Oshibanjo trying to, entrench himself, and all that can lead to a loss of focus, and then that gives Boko Haram, a chance to, if the humanitarian response is not as effective and as thorough as it should be, that also provides an environment in which they can bounce back. And then there are other factors, wider across the region. You must have heard of the recent alliance between Al-Maroutin, Akim, Mojau, now forming a common franchise, trans-Sahelian franchise. Now, we don't know how this is going to link up with Boko Haram and what it would mean for Boko Haram. So there's real concern, and we have to keep watching it. That's why we keep emphasizing sustain military operations, but also, move very quickly on humanitarian operations and on kickstarting the economy of the region, changing the whole environment in order to make sure that, this doesn't, go back to the stage in which it was 5, 6, 10 years, 6, 7 years ago. I think there was a question, why with the international? Well, it's not something I can be happy or sad about, really. But I mean, quite objectively, the international support hasn't been anything comparable to the international engagement and support with the fight against ISIS. But we need to understand the reasons for this. First, Boko Haram developed, emerged, and evolved in a different way from ISIS. It was viewed as a local insurgency, and because its goals at that time were limited to the Nigerian government, its targets were mostly local, and Nigeria was viewed as a country that had a strong enough military to handle that. A great deal of the progress, the victories that Boko Haram won, territories it captured, was not because the international community was not helpful. It was because the Nigerian system itself and the Nigerian military itself was not up to the task of fighting the insurgency. There was a lack of political will, as you know, under the Jonathan administration to confront this issue for quite a long time, until very close to the election. And then they started fire brigade actions trying to catch Boko Haram just because of the election and those kinds of things. So I don't want to say that the international community wasn't helpful. I mean, there were also issues about the Nigerian military itself. There were concerns about the human rights record of the military. And of course, other countries have their laws and criteria for engaging with other militaries, and it's up to every country to determine exactly what it wants to do. So we can't blame the international community for a response that wasn't up to speed, from the Nigerian end. I think the last question was about the relationship between traditional authorities and the civilian.
Or among each other.
What I wanted to ask actually was the relationship between traditional authorities in Cameroon and Nigeria. Are they coordinating their efforts?
From the Nigerian side, I don't think that there is real coordination. There have been long-standing traditional ties, but it doesn't translate to security arrangements. The vigilantes on the Nigerian side, as a matter of fact, you talked about a civilian multinational joint task force. They did say that they would want formal communication, formal channels, a systematized arrangement of linking up and communicating with others. Up to at a point, they were suggesting that they should have an annual forum in which vigilantes from Cameroon come to Nigeria, share information about what they've noticed about movements in remote places and so on. And then maybe the next year it moves to Chad, and the next year it moves to Niger. But something recognizing them as a formal tier of the security structure and providing for communication, interaction, etc., among them on a sustainable basis. But that's their wish for now. There's no discussion at all taking place, and there's no provision for it in the system.
Yeah, just 1 minute. Of course, there is nothing like traditional chief working together. Also important to highlight the nature of different states. Nigeria is a federal state. Cameroon is a very, very central state, and very reluctant to this kind of initiative of people under the state crossing the borders and sharing information. And last 1 minute to the issue of ISIS, just mentioning that, just interesting to look at, I don't know if you have seen the interview that one members of the Al-Banawi faction has delivered to one Al-Qaeda magazine, Al-Risala. I think it was last month or 2 months ago. In general, Al-Qaeda, for example, not ISIS, is coming back and growing in Africa in general. And the fact that the faction of Al-Banawi, which is supposed to be the official faction of ISIS in the Lake Chad Basin, one of the key members is delivering an interview to a mainstream Al-Qaeda magazine. We should not conclude quickly, but maybe it's a possibility that Al-Qaeda could also be interested in coming back in the Lake Chad area.
We are at time. Just one thing on the international cooperation. I mean, the persistent complaint I've heard for years, and then I was just in Nigeria last week from senior military, is the real-time sharing of intelligence and surveillance. And this is just in a situation where you have kind of this quick attack and retreat, that kind of thing is important. And they're saying they're getting it the day after.
Yeah.
And so they have, they see the surveillance maps and they see the group, but it's the day after the attack has happened from the U.S. side. And I do want to kind of probe on the U.S. side, what's the U.S. response to that? In the past, I'd heard, we're sharing it, that it's a communications problem within the Nigerian intelligence and security forces. Other times, well, we're reluctant to share because, this was a year and a half ago because of leaks or what have you. So I think that's a question.
Could I speak to that?
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, I'm sorry, okay. Okay, well, we'll have to leave it on that open question. We could take a lot more time with both of you. Thank you so much, and thank you to all, and thank you to EJ and to Mark and to the crisis group for thinking of CSIS and coming to talk with us.
Thank you very much.